If you believe true strength does not need to announce itself, that the most dangerous person in the room is often the quietest, then this story is for you. It is a testament to the immutable law that ego is a fragile shield, while competence is a silent, unbreakable sword. The Combat Information Center of the Deep Space Command Station Aegis 7 was a cathedral consecrated to the god of data. Its vaulted ceiling was a black firmament pricked with the cold, distant light of status indicators. Below, concentric rings of consoles formed tiered pews where the faithful, the bridge crew, attended to the ceaseless liturgy of system diagnostics and sensor readings. The air itself was a processed, sterile medium, scrubbed of all organic personality and scented with the faint electric tang of ozone and the dry metallic aroma of overworked processors. A constant, subliminal hum vibrated through the deck plating, a deep and resonant mantra sung by the station's fusion reactor, a sun held captive in a magnetic bottle miles below. It was a sound that was not so much heard as it was felt, a pressure in the bones that served as a perpetual reminder of their isolation, a million miles from anything that could be called home. At the heart of this metallic temple, on a raised dais that served as its altar, stood Colonel Marcus Vance. He was a large man, built not with the dense functional muscle of a soldier, but with the broad, declarative mass of someone who occupied space as a matter of right. His uniform was immaculate, the creases sharp enough to cut, the decorations on his chest a boastful narrative of a career spent in the right meetings. He did not command the CIC, he performed it. His voice was a powerful baritone that filled every corner of the room, a tool he used to hammer his authority into the consciousness of his subordinates. He was holding his daily morning brief, but it was less an impartation of information and more a one-man show. "And operations," he boomed, gesturing with a flourish toward a nervous-looking lieutenant, "assures me that the new sensor recalibration will be completed by 1300, which, if I recall, is what they assured me yesterday." A ripple of sycophantic laughter, thin and anxious, dutifully spread through the assembled officers. Vance smiled, a predator's baring of teeth. "Let us hope today's assurances have a bit more substance." He paced the dais, his boots striking the deck with loud rhythmic reports, each footfall a punctuation mark in his monologue of power. He was a roaring bonfire in the center of the cold, dark room, demanding attention, demanding warmth, demanding to be seen as the sole source of light and heat. In the periphery, tucked away in the lowest tier of the CIC, sat a figure that was his complete antithesis. She was a pocket of absolute silence, a void where the colonel's gravitational pull of personality seemed to fail. Her official designation was Specialist Thorne, a temporary attachment from the Fleet Logistics Command, assigned to audit the station's supply chain software and diagnostic protocols. She was slight of build, her form lost in the sterile gray of her fatigues, which bore no rank, no insignia, no story. Her hair was pulled back in a severe functional knot, and her face, when she looked up from her console, was a mask of placid neutrality. She was not observing the colonel's performance. Her attention was directed entirely at the small secondary terminal before her, her fingers moving with an unnerving economy across the keypad, her posture one of absolute meditative stillness. She was not a part of the CIC's ecosystem. She was an anomaly, a shard of obsidian in a room of polished chrome, absorbing light and sound and giving nothing back. It was this very stillness, this utter lack of participation in his carefully orchestrated reality, that drew the colonel's eye. He paused his pacing, his gaze zeroing in on her like a targeting laser. The hum of the station seemed to deepen as the focus of the room shifted with him. He saw a junior technician, a woman no less, hunched over a console while he, her commanding officer, was speaking. He saw disrespect. He saw an opportunity. "Specialist," he said, his voice dropping into a register of theatrical disappointment. The room went quiet. "Am I boring you?" Thorne did not react for a full 3 seconds. It was not a delay of surprise or fear, but of process. A query had been entered. It was being analyzed for relevance. Finally, her fingers stopped moving. She raised her head, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were a flat, neutral gray, like a winter sky over a frozen lake. They held no defiance, no apology, no emotion at all. They were the lenses of a complex sensor, gathering data. "No, Colonel," she replied. Her voice was low and clear, without inflection. It was a statement of fact, nothing more. The simple, direct answer seemed to wrong-foot him. He had expected stammering, an excuse, a flustered apology. Her clinical response gave him no purchase. He decided to press the attack, to force the reaction he desired. "Then perhaps you could enlighten us all. What vital task requires your undivided attention during a command briefing? Are you charting a new course to a previously unknown galaxy of paperwork?" More laughter, this time louder, more confident. The crew took their cue from their commander. Thorne was the target. It was safe. "I am running a tertiary diagnostic on the environmental control system's backup power relays," she stated, her tone unchanged. "The last formal test was 372 days ago. Standard fleet protocol requires a quarterly check." The technical precision of her answer was an unwelcome intrusion into his theater. It was a fact, and facts were messy, inconvenient things that cluttered the clean lines of his authority. He waved a dismissive hand, a grand gesture of magnanimity that was, in reality, an act of erasure. "Ah, a diligent little worker bee, buzzing away in the background. Very commendable." He turned his back on her, a physical act of dismissal that broadcast her irrelevance to the rest of the crew. "But the grown-ups are talking now. Leave the important work to us, specialist. You can get back to your checks and balances when we're done." He resumed his briefing, his voice once again swelling to fill the space she had briefly occupied. The crew, as one, turned their attention back to him. Specialist Thorne was forgotten. She lowered her head and her fingers resumed their silent, economical dance across the keyboard. Lieutenant Eva Rostova, the young signals officer Vance had chided earlier, cast a final, confused glance toward the quiet specialist. She felt a pang of vicarious humiliation for the woman, but it was mixed with a strange sense of unease. Thorne's non-reaction was not submissive. It was geological. It was the quiet of a mountain which does not care whether a king praises it or a fool mocks it. It simply is. Rostova turned back to the briefing, pushing the unsettling thought aside. The colonel was loud, he was in charge, and that was the structure of her world. Colonel Vance saw a timid mouse, a low-ranking functionary properly cowed and put back in her place. He saw his own authority reinforced, his dominance demonstrated. He saw what his ego needed him to see. He did not see the truth. He did not see the predator assessing the weaknesses of the herd. He did not see the surgeon diagnosing a terminal illness in the command structure. He did not see General Aris Thorne, and this failure of perception would be the beginning of his end. The system had been observed. The bug in the code had been identified. A correction, he knew, was not a matter of if, but when. And General Thorne, in her quiet corner, continued her work, a patient engine of methodical reality, waiting for the performance to be over and the real world to inevitably assert itself. For another hour, the performance continued. Colonel Vance pontificated on readiness, on discipline, on the unassailable might of Aegis 7. He was a master of the vocabulary of power, weaving tales of his own past triumphs, carefully edited for maximum effect, into lessons for his crew. He moved through the CIC like a proprietor, adjusting a screen here, clapping a shoulder there, his every action a reinforcement of his own centrality. To Lieutenant Rostova, it was the normal state of affairs. Command was supposed to be confident, decisive, even theatrical. It was a show of strength meant to inspire confidence in the chain of command. She, like everyone else, had learned to filter the signal from the noise, to extract the actual orders from the cloud of self-aggrandizement that surrounded them. Specialist Thorne, however, processed it all as raw data. With every boast, she cross-referenced Vance's service record stored in her own eidetic memory. The incident on Cygnus X-1 he claimed as a tactical masterstroke was, in the official after-action report, a near disaster salvaged by a chief petty officer who had to override Vance's orders. The brilliant political maneuver he described at command headquarters was, in reality, a backroom deal that had sacrificed a more competent officer's career for his own advancement. She cataloged every lie, every exaggeration. To her, Vance was not a commander. He was a monument to systemic inefficiency, a case study in how ego could be mistaken for ability. He was a critical failure waiting to happen. Her diagnostics were not limited to the station's hardware. The moment the universe decided to call the colonel's bluff came without warning. It was not a sound, but a sudden, violent absence of it. The deep, bone-felt hum of the reactor ceased, replaced by an abyssal silence that was more terrifying than any alarm. For a single, suspended heartbeat, the CIC was plunged into absolute darkness. The only light, the faint, ghostly after-image of the tactical displays, burned into the retinas of the crew. Then came the jolt, a brutal physical blow that slammed the station sideways. It felt less like an impact and more like reality itself had been violently shaken. Unsecured objects became projectiles. Men and women were thrown from their chairs. A scream, sharp and terrified, cut through the darkness before being choked off by a sickening crunch. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting the scene in a hellish, strobing red. The CIC was a wreck. Consoles sparked and smoked. One of the large overhead monitors had torn free and now lay shattered across a navigation terminal. A senior NCO lay half-buried beneath it, unnaturally still. "Report!" Vance's voice, for the first time, held a raw, ragged edge of panic. He was clinging to his command lectern, his knuckles white. "What in the hell was that? Damage report now." "No, nothing, sir," stammered Lieutenant Rostova, pulling herself up from the deck. Her console was dead, a sheet of black glass. "All systems are offline. Main power is gone. I'm not getting any data." "A massive EM pulse, Colonel," shouted another officer from the science station, his face illuminated by the frantic glow of a handheld datapad. "Off the charts. Looks like a coronal mass ejection from the primary star, but bigger. Much bigger." Before anyone could process this, a secondary explosion, deeper and more visceral, rocked the station. This one was accompanied by the screech of tortured metal and the smell of burning plastic and ozone. A voice, strained and filled with static, crackled over a battery-powered emergency comm unit. "Engineering to CIC. We have a plasma conduit rupture in Sector Gamma. Fire suppression is offline. We have multiple casualties. We are losing containment." The message cut out into a burst of static. The implications were catastrophic. A plasma fire, unchecked, would burn through the station's spine in minutes. Chaos erupted. Vance, his face a mask of disbelief, began shouting a flurry of contradictory orders. "Get me engineering back on the line. Reroute auxiliary power to fire suppression. Someone get me a damn damage report. Where are my shields?" His commands were shotgun blasts of panic in the dark, hitting nothing, only adding to the confusion. His crew, trained to respond to his authority, was paralyzed, looking to him for a clear direction that he was utterly incapable of providing. They were a body whose brain had just suffered a massive stroke. The roaring bonfire had been snuffed out, leaving behind only acrid smoke and panicked confusion. It was in this vacuum of command, in this maelstrom of failure, that Specialist Thorne moved. She did not rise in a panic. She rose with the deliberate, inexorable motion of a hydraulic press. The chaos did not touch her. The screams, the sparks, the strobing red lights, it was all just data flowing into her, being processed, sorted, and prioritized. She did not run. She flowed through the wreckage, her movements economical and precise. She bypassed the dead command consoles, her destination a nondescript maintenance panel set into the bulkhead. While others saw a wall, she saw the station's central nervous system. She produced a multi-tool from a simple pouch on her belt. It was not standard issue. It was a custom-fabricated instrument of surgical precision. Her fingers, with a surgeon's dexterity, pried the panel open, revealing a dense, intimidating nest of fiber-optic cables and power conduits. Vance saw her movement out of the corner of his eye. It was purposeful, which in his panicked state registered as insubordination. "Specialist!" he bellowed, his voice cracking. "What in the seven hells do you think you're doing? Get back to your post and await orders." She did not even grant him a glance. It would have been a waste of 0.6 seconds. He was irrelevant data, a background process that had crashed. Her focus was absolute. From another pouch, she produced a set of micro-jumpers and a small, self-powered diagnostic reader. Her hands moved with a blur, not in the frantic motions of panic, but with the hyper-efficient speed of someone who has performed the same complex task 1,000 times. She was not trying to hack the system through software. The system was dead. She was performing emergency neurosurgery, physically bypassing the damaged pathways and creating new ones. She attached the reader, and its small screen flickered to life, displaying cascading lines of raw code. It was the station's dying scream translated into language she could understand. "Plasma conduit G7 is hemorrhaging," she said, her voice cutting through the din. It was not loud, but it had a quality of absolute clarity that made everyone freeze. The primary overload triggered a feedback loop in the coolant regulation system. Fire suppression in that sector is offline because its control node was routed through the same junction that just melted. She was not speaking to anyone in particular. She was narrating the diagnosis. Just then, a new alarm, a high-pitched, piercing shriek, began to sound from the one science station still running on battery backup. "Sir, proximity alert," the science officer yelled, his voice thin with terror. "A vessel just decloaked off our port bow. 50,000 kilometers and closing. No transponder, no IFF. It's powering weapons." The final piece of the nightmare fell into place. The CME had not been an accident. It had been cover. They had been deliberately disabled, and now the wolves were circling. Vance stared at the flickering tactical icon on the science officer's pad. This was it. The ultimate test. A scenario no simulator could ever truly replicate. His mind was a blank page. His entire career had been a performance, and the curtain had just come down on a scene he hadn't rehearsed. "Weapons," he croaked, his voice a ghost of its former authority. "Get me tactical online. Target that vessel." "We can't, sir," Rostova cried out. "There's no power to the weapon systems. We're dead in the water." The colonel stared, his face slack, his eyes wide with the stark animal terror of a man who finally understood that he was no longer in control. He was no longer a commander. He was just a man in a metal box about to be torn open. The station, and everyone in it, was going to die. And it was going to be his fault. And in that moment of absolute despair, Specialist Thorne spoke again. Her voice was the calmest thing in the universe. "Lieutenant Rostova." Rostova flinched, turning to the source of the voice. Thorne was still at the open panel, but her head was turned, her gray eyes locked onto the young officer. They were not panicked, they were not even urgent. They were calculating. "The main reactor is in a terminal overload cascade," Thorne stated, as if reading a weather report. "The magnetic containment field will fail in approximately 84 seconds. You must manually vent the primary plasma coolant into reserve tank Gamma 7. The emergency release terminal is 3 meters behind you, to your left. The access panel requires a physical key, which is located in the crash kit under your console. The override code you will need to enter is 91 Tango Kilo 4. Every word was precise, clear, and absolute. It was not an order born of panic, but a sequence of instructions derived from an impossibly fast analysis. Rostova found herself caught between two poles of authority. In front of her was the colonel, the designated commander, now reduced to a statue of frozen terror. To her side was the specialist, the non-entity, who was now radiating an aura of such profound competence that it was a physical force. She looked at Vance, who just stared blankly, lost. She looked back at Thorne. There was no choice. There was only the path to survival. "Yes, specialist," Rostova said, the word coming out before she even thought it. She scrambled for the crash kit, her hands finding the heavy brass key. She lunged for the terminal Thorne had indicated, a panel she had never even noticed before. Thorne had already moved on. Her attention shifted to the fallen NCO, half crushed beneath the monitor. A young ensign was kneeling beside him, trying uselessly to move the massive piece of equipment. "Stop," Thorne commanded. The ensign froze. "Do not move him. The monitor is acting as a pressure dressing. Moving it will cause catastrophic exsanguination. Check his pulse at the carotid artery. Report his respiration rate." She then turned her gaze to another officer, a comms tech who was clutching his side where a piece of shrapnel from an exploding console had embedded itself. "You," she said, pointing, "do not remove the shrapnel. It is plugging the wound. Your uniform has a med kit in the left thigh pocket. Remove the compressed bandage and apply it directly over the wound, around the object. Use your full body weight. Keep your heart rate below 120 beats per minute. Panic will kill you faster than the injury." She had diagnosed and issued treatment protocols for 2 critical casualties from across a debris-strewn room in less than 10 seconds, without ever touching them. She was a one-woman triage unit, her mind a supercharged medical scanner. Finally, she turned her full attention to the tactical problem. She strode to the master command console, the one on the dais, the colonel's throne. Vance was still standing beside it, a mannequin in a uniform. "Colonel," she said, her voice a flat line of operational necessity. "The enemy vessel is charging its primary energy weapon. Estimated time to firing solution is 1 minute. We must shift all available power, including emergency life support from non-essential decks, to the aft shield emitters and the port side point defense cannons." This broke Vance's paralysis. A flicker of his old arrogant self returned, a muscle memory of command. You don't give orders here, specialist," he stammered, his voice weak but defiant. "I am in command of this station." Thorne did not waste time arguing. She did not try to persuade him. She simply reached past him to the console's interface. Her fingers danced over the security keypad. Vance lunged to stop her, to assert his final pathetic shred of authority. "I said no! That's a command lock!" He stopped, his mouth hanging open. The screen, which had been displaying a red command lockout, Vance, miscall message, flickered. It flashed green. New text appeared, stark and absolute against the black screen. / prime directive override authorization XG-001 //. Below it, in smaller text, a designation that was the stuff of legend and rumor in the fleet, a ghost story whispered by senior officers, General A. Thorne, Inspectorate General. The entire bridge crew, those who were still standing, saw it. The code was mythical. It was the digital equivalent of God's own signature, an override that superseded fleet admirals, high command, even emergency wartime protocols. It was an authorization that existed outside the normal chain of command, accountable only to itself. Colonel Marcus Vance stared at the screen, then at the small, quiet woman beside him. The blood drained from his face. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. In a way, he had. He had seen the ghost of his career, his authority, his entire identity evaporate before his eyes. The woman he had mocked, the diligent little worker bee, held an authority so absolute it rendered his entire existence meaningless. Thorne ignored his collapse. The data was on the screen. The system had accepted her command. That was all that mattered. She was now the station. Her mind was its central processor. Her will was its operating system. "Helm," she began, her voice the only anchor in the swirling chaos. "Full stop. Kill all rotational momentum. Use maneuvering thrusters to present our aft quarter to the enemy vessel. The armor is thickest there." "We don't have power to the main thrusters," the helm officer replied. "You do now," Thorne said, her fingers still flying across the console, rerouting trickles of power from a dozen subsystems: cargo bay lighting, water recyclers, the officer's mess coffee machine. "It will be intermittent. Fire in 0.5-second bursts. Use the gravitational distortions from the gas giant below as a slingshot. Execute." "Rostova," she continued without looking at the lieutenant, "the reactor is vented. Good. Now, access the secondary coolant system and prepare to overload the release valve on my mark. We are going to vent a cloud of superheated plasma as a decoy." "But specialist, General, that's not what it's for. It could flash fry the entire aft section," Rostova protested, her mind struggling to keep up. "The aft section is already compromised. The components are rated to withstand the thermal load for 3.4 seconds before catastrophic failure. The enemy's targeting sensors are primitive. They will mistake the plasma bloom for our reactor going critical. It will buy us 4 seconds. Do it." The commands were alien, terrifying, brilliant. She was not following any known tactical doctrine. She was treating the station not as a warship, but as a complex, damaged machine, using its broken parts in ways their designers had never imagined. She was turning its weaknesses into weapons. "Tactical," she snapped. "You now have 17% power to the port side point defense cannons, not enough to penetrate their shields. So do not target the ship. Target their weapons' energy bloom. Fire a continuous predictive spread directly into the focal point of their energy charge. We will use their own power against them." It was an insane gamble, a shot that was mathematically, physically almost impossible. It required a level of targeting precision that was purely theoretical. "I can't get a targeting lock," the tactical officer shouted, his hands shaking. "Do not use the targeting computer," Thorne instructed, her voice cold as the void outside. "It is too slow. Slave the targeting controls to the primary navigational sensor array. I am feeding you a firing solution based on the gravitational lensing of the enemy ship's mass. Fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." The station shuddered as the point defense cannons, starved for power, fired a weak-looking stream of projectiles. At the same moment, on Thorne's command, Rostova vented the plasma. A massive, blindingly bright cloud of incandescent gas erupted from the station's stern. Just as Thorne predicted, the enemy vessel's main weapon, which had been glowing with imminent power, wavered. Its automated targeting system, confused by the sudden massive energy signature of the plasma decoy, tried to retarget. For a priceless few seconds, its firing chamber was exposed. The stream of point defense rounds, fired not at the ship but at a precise point in empty space, flew directly into that momentary vulnerability. The result was not a simple explosion. It was a feedback loop. The station's humble projectiles disrupted the magnetic containment of the enemy's weapon, causing its own massive energy charge to detonate inside the ship. The hostile vessel did not explode. It imploded. It flashed once, a silent miniature star, and then it was simply gone, leaving behind nothing but a shimmering distortion in space that quickly faded. Silence. The CIC was utterly silent. The strobing red lights had been replaced by a steady, dim emergency white. The violent alarms were gone, replaced by the gentle hum of stabilized, rerouted power. The only sounds were the pained groans of the injured, the frantic, relieved breathing of the survivors, and the quiet, rhythmic tapping as General Aris Thorne entered the final lines of a stabilization script into the command console. She had taken a crippled, dying station with a panicked crew and a broken commander, and in the space of 3 minutes had turned it into a weapon that had accomplished the impossible. She had not shouted. She had not panicked. She had simply analyzed, calculated, and corrected. Lieutenant Rostova stared at her, her awe so profound, it felt like a religious experience. She had just witnessed a miracle, not a miracle of faith, but a miracle of competence. Colonel Vance had slid down the wall and was now sitting on the deck, his head in his hands, a broken man in a ruined temple. The rest of the crew just stood, or leaned, or lay, staring at the quiet woman on the dais, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning, profound reverence. The performance was over. Reality had been restored. In the profound silence that followed the impossible victory, a new sound emerged, a crisp, formal chime from the command console. It was the priority channel, a direct line to Fleet Command, a secure connection request. Thorne, her face impassive, accepted the call. The main view screen, which had been a black void, flickered to life. The face that appeared was old, lined with the stress of decades of command, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He wore the uniform of a fleet admiral, the highest rank in the service. It was Admiral Kalin, a man whose name was synonymous with institutional wisdom. He was one of the few who knew her true identity, the architect of her quiet mission. His expression was grim, his jaw set. "Aegis 7, this is Fleet Admiral Kalin." His voice was gravelly, carrying the weight of his office. "Report your status. We registered a massive energy event, then your transponder went dark. We feared the worst." Colonel Vance stirred. A last pathetic flicker of instinct kicked in. He was still the station commander on paper. He staggered to his feet, swaying slightly, and approached the screen. He tried to compose his face into a mask of authority, but it was a shattered, ill-fitting thing. "Admiral," he began, his voice hoarse, "this is Colonel Vance. We sustained heavy damage, a solar flare, followed by an unprovoked attack from a hostile of unknown origin." He took a breath, trying to build momentum, to rewrite the last 10 minutes of history. "The situation was critical, but I managed to rally the crew. We repelled the attacker. The station is secure." He glanced around the CIC as if seeking confirmation, but he was met with a sea of blank, accusing stares. Lieutenant Rostova looked at him not with insubordination, but with a kind of clinical pity. Admiral Kalin's eyes narrowed. He was a man who had spent 50 years listening to reports, and he could smell a lie from half a galaxy away. "Is that so, Colonel? Your account seems incomplete." The Admiral's gaze shifted slightly, as if looking at data on a screen just out of view. "My logs from your station's black box, which miraculously just re-established a data link, show a different story. They show a 94-second period of complete command paralysis following the initial attack. They show a series of contradictory and nonsensical orders. And then," he paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air, "they show a system-wide command override originating from a temporary logistics specialist's authorization." Vance froze, his face turning a sickly mottled white. He was a man watching his own autopsy report being read aloud. "Specialist Thorne," the Admiral's voice commanded, "please step into the frame." Thorne moved from the console to the center of the dais, positioning herself directly in the view of the pickup. She did not look at Vance. She did not look at the crew. She looked directly at the screen, her expression as neutral as it had been when she was calibrating diagnostics an eternity ago. She was a pane of clear glass, simply there. "Colonel Vance," Admiral Kalin's voice turned to solid ice, "I feel it is time for a formal introduction. This specialist is General Eris Thorne, Chief of the Inspectorate General's Special Operations Division. Her presence on your station was not for a software audit. She was there to conduct a quiet, comprehensive evaluation of your command readiness under pressure. The complete logs from the last 2 hours, audio, video, system commands, and the crew's biometric data constitute her final report." The words fell into the silent room like slabs of granite. Inspectorate General. The fleet's internal affairs, its most feared and respected branch. They were the ghosts, the auditors of souls, the final arbiters of competence. And Vance had not only failed their test, he had mocked the examiner. He made a small, choking sound and stumbled backward, collapsing into his command chair. It was no longer a throne. It was a dock for the accused. He stared at Thorne, at the unassuming woman in the plain fatigues. He saw her now. He saw the immensity of her, the terrifying depth behind those calm gray eyes. He had been standing on the lip of a volcano, complaining that the ground was warm. The sheer scale of his misjudgment, of his hubris, crushed him. "General Thorne," the Admiral said, his tone shifting instantly from prosecutorial ice to one of profound collegial respect. "Your assessment?" For the first time, Thorne turned her head and looked directly at Colonel Vance. Her gaze was not filled with triumph or anger or pity. It was the dispassionate, analytical gaze of an engineer examining a faulty component. It was the most devastating judgment he had ever received. "Analysis complete," she said, her voice the auditory equivalent of a printed report. "Command ego compromised system integrity at multiple critical junctures. The colonel's performance-oriented leadership style created a culture of deference over initiative. His response to initial crisis indicators was denial, followed by panicked, contradictory directives that exacerbated the system cascade. Leadership failure resulted in 2 preventable casualties and brought a Tier 1 strategic asset to 98% probability of total loss." She paused, her gray eyes still locked on the broken man in the chair. "The colonel's not a commander. He's a bug in the code, a critical liability to the system. The evaluation is negative." Each word was a nail in the coffin of his career. Bug in the code, liability, the finality of it was absolute. There was no appeal. There was no argument. It was a statement of fact from the highest authority on the matter. The Admiral on the screen nodded slowly, his face a grim mask of acceptance. "Understood, General. Your report is received and logged." He then lifted his gaze, looking past Thorne to the rest of the shaken crew. His voice regained its command tone, but it was now the voice of a teacher, not a prosecutor. "Let this be a lesson to every one of you," he said, his voice echoing in the silent CIC. "A lesson you will carry for the rest of your careers. True authority is not worn on a collar or announced with a loud voice. It is not performed. It is demonstrated. In the crucible of crisis, the chain of command is not determined by rank, but by competence. Competence is the only rank that matters. Today, you saw the difference. He looked back at Thorne, his expression softening into one of pure, unadulterated respect. And then he did something that sent a shockwave through the room, an act that defied 100 years of military protocol. Fleet Admiral Kalin, from his flag bridge half a sector away, stood ramrod straight. He brought his hand up in a crisp, formal salute. It was not a salute to a subordinate or even a peer. It was the salute of a student to a master, of the institution itself, bowing to a higher principle. He was not saluting a general. He was saluting competence made manifest. For a moment, the crew of Aegis 7 was frozen, unsure how to react to this unprecedented event. Then, Lieutenant Eva Rostova, her face streaked with grime and tears of awe, turned away from the screen. She faced General Thorne. She drew herself to her full height, her exhaustion forgotten, and she too rendered a sharp, perfect salute. It was a spark. One by one, like a current passing through them, the other survivors on the bridge followed her lead. The helm officer, the tactical officer still trembling with adrenaline, the young ensign standing guard over his fallen comrade. They all turned to face the quiet woman on the dais. They stood straight amidst the wreckage, and they saluted. They were not saluting a rank they had only just learned. They were saluting the woman who had walked through the fire and led them out, the still point in the turning world, the absolute who had saved them all. General Eris Thorne did not salute back. A salute was a symbol, a piece of social grammar. She dealt in reality. Instead, she surveyed the room, her gaze sweeping over the saluting crew, the broken kernel, the stabilized systems. The system had been stressed, the flaw had been purged, and equilibrium had been restored. The correction was complete. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a final, clinical closing of the file. Then she turned and walked back to her secondary console, her job done. The legend of the quiet general had just been born, not in a blaze of glory, but in the profound, reverent silence of a broken bridge.